you all for joining us tonight. My name is Julie Ty. I'm president of the New York League of Conservation Voters Education Fund. Our mission at the New York League of Conservation Voters Education Fund is to educate, engage, and empower New Yorkers to be effective advocates for the environment. We equip voters with information about climate and sustainability issues, and we encourage them to hold candidates accountable to their promises. This critical election season, we are also encouraging people to take a pledge to vote early for the environment. We're putting a link in the chat where you can sign up to take the pledge, and please tell your friends. Early voting is easy and safe and allows for social distancing. It starts on October 24th, and a reminder that Election Day is November 3rd. The environmental issues in the 55th Senate District vary as widely as the geography of the district. From public transportation in Rochester, to preserving natural areas near Lake Ontario and the Finger Lakes, to the growth of renewable energy projects like wind turbines and solar arrays. Senator Richard Funke has been a good partner in getting positive environmental legislation through. He supported policies to remove toxins from our environment, including requiring schools to test their water for lead, one of our top priorities. He also supported legislation to preserve farmland and promote solar power. We want to make sure the next senator makes climate change and sustainability a top priority. And that's why we're holding this forum, to make sure the environment is top of mind for both candidates and voters. Climate change is a continuous reminder that our actions affect the environment and what happens when we don't work to advocate for it. By being here, all of you are helping us send a message that New Yorkers care about having a healthy environment, a livable climate for future generations, and are paying attention during this election. I want to thank our valuable partners in this forum, Citizens Climate Lobby Rochester and the Rochester People's Climate Coalition. Because this is a virtual forum, let me go over some of the ground rules before we start. We'll start with an opening statement from our first candidate. Our moderator will proceed with some questions, including a lightning round of short yes or no type questions with an emphasis on short. We'll then ask a few audience questions. After that, we'll hear from our second candidate and ask them all of the same questions. As a reminder, please make sure to submit your questions via the Q&A function by 6:30. Now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator. Jeremy Mole is the news editor of Rochester City Paper. Welcome, Jeremy.
Hey, thanks for having me. Oh, right. Our first candidate is going to be Republican Chris Missick from Victor.
Great. You ready? My name's Chris Missick, and I'm running for the Senate seat for the 55th Senate District. And I think I bring a unique background to this election. You know, I wasn't born here, but I made it my choice to move here. And I love this district and I love this place. And I've got a great history with the region, all over Monroe County and Ontario County. I think one of the things that makes my view on how we're going to address the issues related to climate change in the district, in the state, and in our country unique is the fact that my job, my livelihood, is so closely tied and connected to the earth. I'm a small farmer. I grow grapes on the west side of Seneca Lake. I'm a winemaker. We use water from the lake. We access water from a well. We practice integrated pest management. We farm with an eye towards the best environmental practices. And I think what that does is that ties me and that connects me to the soil in a way that it is literally under my fingernails, especially during harvest every year. I think the first thing we need to recognize is climate change is real. That's not a debate that we're having here. What we need to focus on is how we're best going to go about promoting policies in this state that protect our air, that protect our water, that keep our kids safe, that keep our farmland preserved, and that pursue policies that will lead to a healthier environment for all of us. Because, you know, this isn't just something we use today, this is an inheritance that we need to safeguard for future generations. When I think about how we're going to go about doing that, and how we're going to go about improving the lives of folks in this district, I do think about job creation. And why do I think about that? I think about that because in the United States, we have better environmental protection laws than a lot of places around the world where manufacturing takes place. To me, the idea of reshoring our manufacturing and providing jobs for our citizens in this state, that is uniquely tied to improving the environment for our entire world.
Chris, I'm seeing that we're out of time for the introductory remarks, but I think you'll be able to continue this with the question I'm about to ask.
Great.
You touched on this just a moment ago, or started to touch on this just a moment ago. How would your background inform your approach to environmental policy? Are there any specific issues, big or small, on which you'd want to lead?
Yeah, so, you know, just my background as a veteran was witnessing the burn pits, which were terrible. My other career was as a lawyer, so I understand regulation and how laws work. But when I talk about my commitment to our farmland, when I talk about our commitment to our water, you know, one of the centerpieces of the legislation in this state is the Environmental Protection Fund. We need to do things like double the amount that is available to $600 million. We need to make sure that we're taking all of those regulatory steps to protect that. And I think that my background puts me uniquely aware in almost a visceral sense to what's happening with the environment in our region.
Okay. On that note, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act sets goals for New York to have 100% clean energy by 2040 and be carbon neutral by 2050.
Yep.
Those are ambitious goals, and further legislation will likely be required to meet them. Would you support legislation toward that end? And if so, what are some bills that you would introduce or co-sponsor to help New York achieve its climate goals?
Well, I think clearly what that means is we need to focus on expanding the alternate uses or alternate avenues for energy. So that includes increased funding for wind, for solar. But I think most importantly, it involves increased funding for the battery technologies to store those. And that does tie in with infrastructure development, because without adequate storage and infrastructure related to transmission to save that energy that gets produced, we're not going to be able to access it. So we need to make sure funding goes in those avenues to ensure that the technology advances with our goals.
Okay. Many environmentalists are enthusiastic about the potential for renewable energy projects to create new jobs. What could the state do, and what would you do to ensure that the green jobs are being created in the 55th district?
I think first and foremost, define what those jobs are. We set reasonable expectations, and we utilize the proposal of the infrastructure bank to ensure that we have the ability to attract businesses, either startups in the region or folks with expertise who realize that we now have the basis to build that sort of manufacturing here. I think, you know, one of the problems that I've seen is oftentimes people answer with, well, how are we going to rebuild our economy and offer these technologies? And the answer is just, well, we're going to provide green jobs. What I'm providing is the baseline for establishing the infrastructure necessary to get those companies and to get those advancements moving forward.
Okay. The 55th district includes both Lake Ontario and some of the Finger Lakes. I believe Seneca is the one you're familiar with. All of them are vital natural resources. What action does the state need to take to protect those resources, and what do you see as your role in protecting those resources?
Yeah, so in the district, we have Canandaigua Lake and a couple other smaller lakes, not Canandaigua. So what I think we need to really be focused on is ensuring water quality. I've done this in my past. I've been an advocate against the trash trains from New York. I've been an advocate against the trash incinerator that was being built on Seneca Lake. I was an advocate against the LPG storage in the salt caverns. You know, one of the things we needed to focus on there was how that was going to be impacting drinking water, impacting everything from algae blooms to really this whole line of issues. When it impacts the quality of life so immediately, but then in the long term, we need people who are willing to stand up. You know, quality of life, especially in the district outside of the water areas, really has so much to do with landfills and everything that impacts. You know, I think we need to be a clear voice. And I think when you see someone who's been in the district, who has been an advocate for those issues, that's what I've been.
Okay. Would you support a revision of New York building code standards to require that new buildings be, meet standards suitable for a future without fossil fuels, such as not using natural gas for heating?
Yeah. So this is an interesting issue. When you get into the rural portions of our state, they're still reliant upon LPG and propane for heating. I think that we do need to move away from fossil fuels, but I think that short-cutting natural gas lines actually causes more harm than good in the short term. You know, one of the things that we need to focus on is the health impacts that come from people who are reliant on LPG and propane for heating. One, it's more expensive. Two, the asthma and health effects, and it impacts the health of those who are reliant on that for a very long time. So I would say in the short term, yes, we need to understand natural gas is a solution, especially for heating our homes and energy. But it's not the long-term answer. We need to make sure that we're finding ways to pull all of the innovative technologies that we're developing right now to ensure people live good lives, but safe and healthy lives too.
Okay. Agriculture is obviously a big field in the 55th district. Is there a role for agriculture in helping to cut carbon levels in the atmosphere? And what role can the government play in encouraging that?
Absolutely. You know, one of the important things is areas where there are old farms or cash crops that are no longer grown, planting trees as carbon sinks is important. Another really important aspect is to encourage a bit more diversified agriculture. So many of our farmers are reliant strictly on cash crops. If we moved to a model where we can encourage greater diversity, we're not only focused on improving the health of the soils, we're improving on providing a very different source of agriculture for our community. So I think diversifying the actual products that get grown, focusing on continuing to increase the plantings of trees in areas where there may not be as many, where it's feasible. That is an important part. You know, a lot of folks don't understand how important soil health is and how monoculture or just shifting from one cash crop to another time over time depletes the soils. And it has taken millions of years to build up these soils in many instances. This is, you know, it's not exactly a renewable resource in the sense that you can turn around in a couple of years, repair that. So I would love to see us move with some incentives and a real plan to diversify that.
All right. We're going to move into the lightning round. So I believe they wanted to stress fast answers here. If elected, what committees would you ask to serve on?
I would certainly ask to serve on agriculture. That'd be number one.
Okay.
Infrastructure as well, but
okay. Do you bring reusable bags to go shopping?
I do. I did last night.
Great. Do you carry a reusable water bottle?
You know, I oftentimes don't drink from reusable water or from just regular water bottles. I try and use a fountain or a glass. Most of the time when I'm out, I drink from the hose. So.
All right. What's your favorite park in the district?
Oh boy, that is a tough one. I mean, what I really love about, it's not right in the district, but I really love Durand Eastman Park. It's just adjacent. The next best thing, and it sounds strange, but it has so many connected memories. It's just like taking my son to local neighborhood parks.
Okay. Do you compost?
I do, actually. I do. I have a pretty intensive raised bed garden. I've actually posted some photos on Facebook. My son and I gardening this year. I think it's an important thing. Again, I love soil health. And so there's nothing like using the natural byproducts from our home to build good soils.
Okay. And have you ever driven an electric car?
I have. I haven't been able to buy one yet, but I'm looking forward to it. My brother just bought a Tesla.
All right. Well, we have a little more time. We got through the first 6, so I got some extra questions for you.
Great.
Let's, bear with me. Transportation accounts for 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions in New York State, a figure that continues to rise when it needs to fall. Much of the transportation-related emissions come from from passenger vehicles. What is your plan, or what do you think the state could do to reduce our dependency on private automobiles and the impacts that they have on climate? Or even for strengthening public transportation, which is a big issue for many of the people who live in the city.
Yeah, so one of the benchmark plans, it's part of my infrastructure rollout, is the creation of empowerment zones. What we have found is when we can focus on rebuilding with an infrastructure base, specific urban and rural areas, where we can establish the infrastructure needed to attract businesses. When we can create clusters where we provide live, work, play environments, people not only form a sense of community, it cuts down on the need for transportation. What they need in terms of that live, work, play environment is there right around them. And it fosters more community. What I'm saying is this: what I would focus on is ensuring that in urban and rural areas that are economically distressed, this is where we need to focus on rebuilding, to eliminate the poverty, to provide jobs, but to also reshape how we look at our communities, to ensure that the opportunities for education, for work, for entertainment are all in the immediate area. And I think that can be supplemented as we move forward with whether it be additional rail service, additional biking capacity between these central hubs so that people aren't isolated or locked into a specific area. But I'm a big believer in rail. I'm a big believer in utilizing anything we can to reduce the excessive use of automobiles.
What additional funding programs would you like to see Nyserda offer to help convert existing buildings as well as New York's vehicle fleets to less polluting options, ones that don't create the greenhouse gas emissions that?
Yeah, so, you marked an important point, electric cars, again, focused on expanding battery power. I look at this as a twofer, right? If we can focus on increasing Buy American provisions for New York State, what we can focus on is building those things here we need and creating the sort of communities that I was talking about. So I would absolutely increase Buy American, specifically with regard to items that the state uses that are manufactured in places that don't have the environmental controls we have. Bring these businesses home. Make sure that those jobs are available here. And I think what we'll see is this follow-on effect where we'll see a much better environment because of those decisions and because not only those jobs, but those products are available.
The people least responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions that drive climate change are disproportionately subject to the harmful impacts of climate change, such as longer, hotter heat waves. What should the state be doing to address that inequity?
Clearly we need, specifically with heat waves and people in disadvantaged communities.
Just generally the inequities caused by inequity and who feels the effects of climate change.
Yeah, I think of everything from community cooling centers when we have those sorts of events. But more than anything else, it's offering the opportunities to folks. Again, my answer to that is let's pull people out of poverty. Let's help people who are disadvantaged not be disadvantaged. Let's make sure they have good jobs. Let's make sure that they can provide for themselves and their families and elevate their standard of living in ways that are environmentally conscious.
All right. I think we're going to throw it back to Julie for some of the audience questions.
Yes, we have a number of questions from the audience. Thank you. I will try to do my best not to overlap with the ones that Jeremy asked. So one question is, how do you feel about solar farms?
So on issues like this, I like to respect local communities. They clearly have provided an important segue in terms of renewable energy. But it has been difficult for some people. What I want to see is the use of solar farms in conjunction with lots of other forms of renewables. But again, you know, solar farms without proper transmission lines and storage can be meaningless in some parts of this state throughout some parts of the year. I would leave it up to local communities, but I do think it's an important part of the solution.
Okay, so related, do you support wind power and wind turbines in the district?
You know, I think that some of our best bets for wind power are on Lake Ontario. They're on Long Island, Lake Erie. There is probably room in our district for wind power, and I think that it should be explored.
Great. As someone that cares about soil, what will you do to drive composting and food scrap collection in the district? I did not ask that question, and I did write the state's food waste law.
You know, I honestly think that is a huge, great step because it's such a natural source for decomposition and providing the nutrients that soil needs. I would be an advocate to whether it's providing tax incentives, whatever it takes to encourage particularly, you know, restaurants, but wholesale. I mean, it's amazing how much additional good soil you can build just from the kitchen scraps you have and some yard waste. So education is the first step. I think that education also has to happen on a classroom level. I'll give you an example. The Cornell Agricultural Extension in Monroe County has been working for years to develop a student farm, a place where school-age children could go to learn some of the basics of home gardening all the way to actual farming. If those kids are learning at a young age how essential it is, how beneficial it is, how those items don't just end up in a landfill, but actually go towards something good and can decompose properly, I would fund those sorts of projects. And I think that this learning farm is something we really need to focus on launching in our district.
Thank you. One of the largest sources of carbon-free energy in the region is the Gina nuclear power plant. It is also one of the oldest in the nation. How can we continue the supply of clean energy in the area?
So I do believe that nuclear energy is part of the solution. Now, clearly there are byproducts that need to be dealt with, and we need to do it carefully. But Gannett does a lot in terms of providing power. And I think that as we reevaluate where the best renewable sources of energy are going to come from, we need to continue to keep that plant operating safely, continue those good paying jobs, and look at it as a solution that is part of this multi-pronged approach for supplying renewable energy.
The next question is, there's a lot of energy questions, which is not surprising.
Yeah.
How would you fund the transition away from fossil fuels? I mean, you obviously talked about that a little bit earlier. You know, in a transition, what's the right balance between using market forces, making polluters pay, and direct government spending?
So I think that's a good question. And on that topic, you know, I think about these things a little bit differently. For example, we can use the issue of trade. I think that when America went down the process of hollowing out our manufacturing and using ideas like comparative advantage as ways to justify it, we saw that all we did was hollow out the working and the middle class. The same ideas can be applied here. Now, I don't necessarily think that straight carbon taxes are the best solution, but I also say that it can't just wholly be a market approach without the additional hand of education. We need to make sure people understand the long-term consequences to our planet, to our communities from excessive carbon. So I would say that, let's look at everything on the table. Let's try and build into our cost structure what that long-term cost will be. And let's focus on education.
This is similar to a question that was asked earlier, but what are the most important things that you as a New York State Senator can do to impact climate change? What bills would you support, or tell us about one bill that you would introduce to address climate change?
I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I do want to emphasize this. What we produce in New York still contributes to climate change, but it's a very small portion compared to what happens in places where there are no environmental regulations. I think a big focus that we need to continue to keep our eyes on is this: if we can reshore American manufacturing, if we can bring products that are made in other places in the world where they don't care what happens to their soil and their water and their air, and that does impact us. If we can bring that here, we're making huge strides in benefiting our fight against climate change. So I would say it's the infrastructure bank, because that will provide the basis for bringing these jobs back here, for building these companies here, and having a better environmental impact.
I think you may have indicated this earlier, but we are going to be asking the same question, so I will certainly ask it here. Do you support fully funding the Environmental Protection Fund?
Yes, and I believe it needs to be doubled.
You may have heard you say that earlier.
Yep. I'm sorry, my thoughts were too long on the introduction.
So one of the things that we advocated for this year and helped to get passed with working with the legislature was a bond act, the first environmental bond act in over 25 years. And one of the things that would have focused on is trying to help communities be protected from flooding. Mm-hmm. Do you support advancing a bond act, recognizing obviously the state's fiscal situation? And what do you think we should do to help protect our communities? Obviously, Lake Ontario has seen a lot of changes. We've had record flooding. All the water from all the other states flows through Lake Ontario. So what do you think we need to do to make the community more resilient?
Yeah, we have issues in Irondequoit. We have issues down in the town of Richmond. Flooding is something that seriously impacts folks in the 55th. And I've had friends who've had severe property damage as well. This is part of the idea. And in fact, the infrastructure bank was modeled on the Green Bank, and I would support that bond. But I also believe that working with the infrastructure bank and the Green Bank, we can work in a better way to make sure that we've got water diversions, wastewater diversions, and making sure that that doesn't negatively impact our bodies of water. So I would say fund these projects. We need to look at where development's happening. That's clearly a part of the question too. And I think what we need to do in having conversations in the community, oftentimes there are very serious lags in terms of the communication between folks like at times the DEC or the Department of Transportation, or people not understanding maybe where their authority is in certain issues. And again, I'm thinking specifically of the town of Richmond, Department of Transportation, and debris under a bridge. So it is making sure that we protect valuable wildlife in our state, that we protect our residents as well, and we streamline communication between our state agencies.
Okay. Invasive species are an issue in the district and swallowing up our native plants. Is this an issue you're aware of? And do you think it's important to fight? And if so, how will you do so?
Absolutely. An example from my own life is the spotted lanternfly. This was an invasive pest that, whether you're talking about sound integrated pest management issues, whether you're talking about chemicals I wouldn't use on my farm that other people do, there was no way to fight it. We had to focus on a quarantine and making sure that it wasn't being brought in. That's just one example, but invasive species are an issue. We want to maintain the integrity of our natural environment. There's an entire ecosystem that revolves around what we have here right now. And oftentimes these invasive species throw it entirely out of whack. So I am a proponent of it. I'm a proponent of it, one, because it's sound environmental practice, but two, it impacts so many aspects of the economics of our region as well.
So municipalities are in charge of our wastewater and our drinking water, as you pointed out, talking about that. And we have shown that there are studies that say we need over $30 billion for each of those systems statewide to support water and wastewater infrastructure and to modernize our systems. What do you think we need to do to help cost effectively address those problems with our pipes?
So one, I like these sort of infrastructure jobs because I think that they can provide a great basis for employment. Two, we need to make sure we're doing that for the health of our people. The infrastructure bank model provides a way to capitalize on an initial investment. And so funding it, even kind of what our intention is, money can make money and we can grow that and we can make sure that we address these problems. I think we also need to make sure that we bring the federal government into this. And I also think we need to realize that there's a lot of people in the 55th that aren't on public water and aren't on public waste. And when we have old septic systems, those could be polluting water tables as well. When folks are on wells, they run into issues like everyone in the rural areas run into it from time to time with safe drinking water, coliform, nitrites. So I would like to see us not just focus on preserving and improving existing infrastructure related to water and wastewater, but making sure that folks in our rural districts aren't left out as well.
Great. So Jeremy, I think we are ready to move on.
All right. What are we moving on to?
Chris, you have an opportunity now to give a closing statement.
Great.
Oh, thank you.
You know, I really believe at my core, one, in education, making sure people understand the value of the resources we've been given, protecting that and standing up for it. You know, every couple of years, it feels like there's some new environmental fight we need to wage near my farm and business. We need to make sure people understand what we're trying to preserve here. And we also need to improve the quality of life for our residents as well. And we will do that by improving the infrastructure and the environment at the same time, providing jobs and helping families thrive. I think we need a wholesale new way of thinking in this state with regard to how we're going to do both, improve people's lives so we aren't seeing 100,000 people leave every year, and protect our environment. I really believe we can do that. And we do that with unique and innovative thinking that ensures we can fund the projects we need to fund without overtaxing and overburdening our working and middle income families.
Well,
Thank you so much.
thank you. Oh.
Thank you, Chris, very much for that. We're actually, as we transition between the two candidates, we are actually going to be launching a short poll. So thank you very much, Chris, for your time tonight. We very much appreciate your responsiveness to all of our questions and your brevity. That is not often the case in these candidate forums.
Well, thank you for the time. I appreciate it. And everyone can reach me. It's votemisick.com. And I'd love to chat with anybody who has questions further.
Thank you so much. So at this time, we are going to put a poll up. So thank you very much. We have a fairly short poll. We will give folks a minute or two to answer these poll questions, and then we will move on to the second candidate. Thank you.
Our next candidate, or next up, is the Democratic candidate, Samra Brouk, who lives in the city of Rochester. If you'd like to give your opening statement.
Hi, sorry, I just need to find my Zoom. Give me 1 second. I lost you.
This will allow people a little bit more time to finish
Yeah.
the poll question.
Am I supposed to sign off now?
Yes, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
All right. Let me know when you're ready. Have they had enough time?
I think if you can give us just one more minute, I know we want to announce the results as well.
Oh, okay.
I-
I jumped the gun. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I can mostly tell because the poll is right in front of my face. All right, there we go. So we have the poll results. Thank you very much. Clean energy, as was evidence from the question from the audience, it was very popular with this group. We're happy to see that. That's obviously a big priority for us. And people have a mix of how they're planning on voting this year. So thank you very much. It's very helpful. And Jeremy, back to you. Thank you.
Great. Well, let's try this again. Next up is the Democratic candidate, Samra Brouk from the city of Rochester. You'd like to give your opening statement?
Sure. Thank you, Jeremy. And I just want to say thank you to the New York League of Conservation Voters and the partner organizations for hosting this really important forum today. Right now we know we're all in tough times as we're dealing with multiple crises at once. And the truth is climate change has been a crisis for decades, and we still have so much work to do to protect our communities and build a sustainable future for our young people. And every day we're seeing the effects of climate disruption, whether it's wildfires in the West, bringing visible haze and smoke all the way here to Rochester region, if it's tropical storms that are battering the South and marching up the Northeast, and of course, some of the issues that we deal with closer to home that we've talked about a lot today, the regular flooding that we have in Lake Ontario, the harmful algae blooms over in our Finger Lakes, and some of the extreme weather bringing high winds and knocking out power every spring. The time has really passed for bold action. And it's not only going to allow us to slow down climate disruption, but we also have an opportunity to address the vast inequities we see in who is affected by these disasters and adverse conditions. Just like we've seen with COVID-19, these crises are not equalizers. Instead, they have detrimentally worse effects on low-income communities and communities of color. And that's why I'm committed to not only taking bold action on climate change, but on climate justice. And as a state, our actions can not only lead to preserving our natural resources, but they can lead to better paying jobs, safer communities, and improved health outcomes for all New Yorkers. I spent years working with municipalities to implement environmental programs. I've been on the ground to rebuild communities devastated by natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina. And that's the kind of experience we need in our policymakers. So I am very excited to talk about the work that we can do to here in the 55th district to do our part for the environment and for our communities. And I'm grateful for you all for hosting.
Samra, how would your background inform your approach to environmental policy? And are there any specific issues, big or small, that you would want to lead on? Excuse me, lead on.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think that one of the best parts of my background is kind of this breadth of dealing with different issues. And in fact, the most time I've spent in my career is around climate change. So it's working for a company called Recycle Bank, working with municipalities, towns, villages, and cities all across the Northeast on specifically these issues of building infrastructure to help stop the effects of climate change. And for this, it was specifically around waste streams. And I'll tell you, the reason I got into that work to begin with was because I spent 2 years volunteering with the Peace Corps in Guatemala. And the interesting thing is when you live in a developing country, you don't always have municipal run waste management. And so you are truly responsible for basically dealing with anything that you consume. You've got to deal with where to put it. So that means you've got to figure out what to do with your paper goods, your plastics, your glasses, and you learn so much about what we produce and what we consume as individuals. And so that's why I was drawn to that work, because I knew that governments have incredible opportunity and obligation to take really bold action on making it easier for their residents and individuals to do the right thing. Most people want to do the right thing, but we have to be able to set them up for success by creating these kinds of partnerships, these kinds of public-private partnerships that are able to move us in the right direction. And so I think it comes from, not just living these experiences and understanding the necessity to work on these programs, but also having the experience of working in local governments that have actually been successful in fighting for some of these things and creating more climate smart communities.
The Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act sets goals for New York to have 100% clean energy by 2040 and to be carbon neutral by 2050. Those are ambitious goals, and further legislation will likely be required to meet them. Would you support such legislation? And if so, what are some bills you would introduce or co-sponsor to help New York achieve its climate goals?
Yeah, we've got our work cut out for us. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But here's the thing, to take a step back, we just have to celebrate a moment where part of getting our Democratic majority in the state Senate also meant that we got to move forward with incredible pieces of legislation around climate change, like the CLCPA. And of course, these are bold, aspirational goals, because you don't want to negotiate against yourself, right? This is where we have to aim to go. And I think everyone is really up to the task right now to make sure that we take the steps that we need to move ourselves closer to that goal. And I know right now, there's a lot of attention on our public health crisis, but guess what? This is part of that, right? Climate change is a part of that. Cutting down on pollution, cutting down on emissions, all of that is part of public health as well. And so some of the things that I think we can do is, one, really making sure we're doing a better job of making sure these projects are actually coming to fruition, right? How do we expedite these processes? How do we make it easier for communities to become climate smart communities? And then I think about some of the things that locally, how do we support local organizations, right? I think of RPCC here in Rochester, doing things like the coordinated electrification. How do we make sure that we are not only setting pieces of legislation, sure, but two is making sure that resources are getting into communities who are acting towards these goals. But then the third piece is, how are we helping people create partnerships, whether it's public-private partnerships or whether it's helping organizations connect with their communities to make sure that they can move forward in the right direction.
Okay. Many environmentalists are enthusiastic about the potential for renewable energy projects to create new green jobs. What could the state do, and what would you do to ensure that those green jobs are being created in the 55th district?
I love this question. When I came back from the Peace Corps, my first job was in clean technology. So it was literally living that reality of not knowing what to do with waste. really led me to come in and figure out how can we work with our public sector and our private sector? How can we create new technologies, create new jobs, but that have a net positive effect on our environment and our society as a whole? And I think that's a huge piece of it. So I've had the pleasure of meeting with a number of our higher ed institutions here in the city of Rochester and the surrounding areas. And we've talked about how we can make our region a clean technology hub. How do we invest and incentivize companies here that are grown in our region? How are we making sure that we're recruiting from our technology universities and our science universities to make sure that people with talent are staying in our region to then invest and start companies and innovate around these things? I think that one of the best examples that I know we're really proud of here in Western New York is the New York State Pollution Prevention Institute that's partially housed here at RIT. And when you look at that, that is an opportunity like I'm talking about. It's the kind of thing I think we need to replicate. That is funded through millions of dollars from New York State. It's created hundreds of jobs in our region. And more than that, you'll hear me go back to partnerships a lot. Because what it does is it allows some of our small and medium-sized local businesses to become a part of this clean technology conversation, to become more sustainable. I'm really getting comfortable with this 30-second sheet. It's really, really good, but I was almost done there. So, but in order for them to really move, again, in the right direction, but making that connective tissue that we need, and the state has an opportunity to do that.
The 55th district includes both Lake Ontario and some of the Finger Lakes, all of which are vital natural resources. What action does the state need to take to protect them? And what do you see as your role in protecting these resources?
I mean, water safety is huge here, right? Just to not overstate this, but I just spent last week meeting with the town supervisor of Irondequoit, Dave Seeley, and we took a tour with one of our soon-to-be assembly members up here, took a tour of Lake Ontario to really be able to witness the effects of this. So not only is it, rising water levels that have been damaging homes, damaging marinas, damaging businesses that we need, especially right now. But it's also, there's, certain invasive species that, we were looking at a fish who couldn't live throughout that, through that invasive species. So there's a lot of things that are being affected by this. I think that number one, and I'll tell you, I'm reporting back and I'll report this to Albany from our town supervisors, is the state needs to be able to give the resources to our communities. Here in the Irondequoit area, up on Lake Ontario, we're lucky to have some of the resources we need to fight some of this flooding. But certainly the thing I hear about over and over is when they're in Albany, there's no one right now to answer those calls. And they need someone, especially who's sitting in a majority, who has access to the kinds of resources we need to make sure that we can avoid things like overflow, things like contamination. These are all things that are going to continue to happen until we, one, deal with the problem that we have now, but also as we think about rebuilding and building new, let's make sure we've learned our lessons and that we're setting ourselves up for success for the future.
Would you support a revision of New York building code standards to require that new buildings meet standards suitable for a future without fossil fuels, such as not using natural gas for heating?
So every time I think about climate change, this happens a lot. And to be honest, it's similar to the way we need to react to the public health pandemic too. There's different phases, and we did the same thing when I was down in Biloxi, Mississippi, working on Hurricane Katrina, right? There's these different phases of one, you have to kind of stop the bleeding. You have to deal with what we're dealing with right now. We have to do the best we can with what we have. But when it comes in, and then you have to, learn from those lessons and try to do better in the short term. But when it comes to building new, when it comes to new investments, we have to have the foresight and the courage to make those investments smart, to make them smart investments, to be thinking about how are we going to create a more sustainable community, more sustainable businesses. All the facts are in, and I'm preaching to the choir here, I know. All the facts are in. We know what we need to do in terms of enforcing these codes for new buildings. And so we need to do that. And then on the other hand, we need to also tighten some of these codes. And then also incentivizing folks to do the right thing. Again, most people, whether you're a farmer, whether you're a small business owner, whether you're constructing a building, my own father was an engineer, whether you're constructing these, you want to do the right thing. A lot of people have kids, a lot of people think about future generations, they want to do the right thing. What I see the state government's responsibility is making it a hospitable environment to do that, which means making sure that people can still keep their bottom line if we're asking them to change the way they're doing things, making sure we're training people to move into these positions that we know are going to be more sustainable jobs in the future.
Okay. Is there a role for agriculture in helping to cut carbon levels in the atmosphere? And what role can the government play in encouraging that?
Absolutely, there's a role. I mean, if you ask me, I think there's a role for everyone. I mean, truly, even if we talk about, you know, certain businesses that might get phased out, there's still a role for those people and the training that they've had. I keep going back to COVID because I think that it's a really good example of crisis, but you even see there where some people have been able to shift the same skill sets they have into things that we need in the short term here to deal with this crisis. And I think that that's a way of innovation that we need to continue, including with our farming practices. And, you know, I've had the pleasure of visiting several of our local farms here in Ontario County. And before we even get to their role, you also just hear the pain of the fact that climate change is not a theoretical thing to these folks. This is something that is affecting their everyday. It is affecting their ability to eat. It is affecting their ability to have food on the table for their own kids and money to pay their bills and their mortgages and their rents. So I think that one of the things that we can really do is around training and educating. Again, I really do believe the best, and especially, at least I can speak for the people of the 55th district and these communities. These are folks who want the tools to be able to act in ways that are going to help create more sustainability in their communities. So there's a lot that we can do with training and educating around these more sustainable farming practices. We can invest in anaerobic digesters. That's a huge thing that in terms of agriculture will actually help us with this issue. And we've got examples of that nearby at Noblehurst Farms. So I think both of those things, looking at training, really connecting the resources to our local farmers, which again, really falls on our state representatives to make sure that they can hear and that they're getting what they need. And then also really investing in things that will help our existing farmers, again, move in the right direction, but more than that, be a part of the solution. So that it's not that we're on two sides of the table arguing about this, rather we're all working together because we're all working towards the same goal.
Many environmentalists are enthusiastic about the potential for renewable energy projects to create new green jobs. What could the state do, and what would you do to ensure that those green jobs are being created in the 55th district?
I thought I answered that. Maybe I meant.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I repeat
I'll
a
talk
question?
about it again.
No, that's okay. We're
Lovely.
going to move to the lightning round instead.
I was like, huh.
I thought I skipped it. Oh boy.
All right, no worries.
Here we go. If elected, which committees would you ask to serve on?
I mean, to be honest, given my background, I'd be honored to join Senator Kaminsky on the Environmental Committee, because I think a lot of what we're talking about right now, we've got a lot more work to do. And frankly, I know you said short answer, but sorry. Frankly, I think Western New York needs more representation on that committee if we want to be bringing all these green jobs and move into clean technology.
Okay. Do you bring reusable bags to go shopping?
Of course. You have to, in fact, here. It's great.
Right. Do you carry a reusable water bottle?
Yes.
Okay. What is your favorite park in the district?
This is like choosing children. I just want everyone to understand. I know you probably ask this of other people, but here in the Rochester area, we have some of the best parks you could imagine. They're beautiful, they're vast, but I have to go back to my roots. I grew up around Highland Park in the city of Rochester. It is home to my favorite flower, the lilacs, which we still got to enjoy this year, even though there was no lilac festival. So I think that one has to take the cake. Just don't tell any of the other parks. This isn't being streamed or anything, so it's fine.
Do you compost?
I have to work on this. I currently do not compost, but I know I could do better.
Have you ever driven an electric car?
Have I driven an electric car? I've been driven an electric car. Many friends with Teslas and some hybrids. But what I will say is my husband's job right now is to buy our car, which we're looking at electric and hybrid versions because that's something that's very serious to me, of making sure that we're not continuing to, create more emissions through our passenger cars. So, so that's something that's really important.
Got through our first 6 questions, and I'm thinking we have time for more. No one's told me otherwise. So transportation accounts for 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions in New York State, a figure that continues to rise when it needs to fall. Much of the transportation-related emissions come from private passenger vehicles. What's your plan for reducing the impacts of those vehicles on climate and the dependency on those vehicles, or even for strengthening public transportation?
Yeah, this is a really big one. And I actually think that if you'll allow me, I want to go big again, kind of go to the 30,000 foot view. Because one of the things that I've been talking about a lot with voters at this point, we've talked to thousands and thousands of voters in the district. One of the things that we talk about a lot is people will ask me about climate change and what are we going to do with the CLCPA and all of these different things. And they're worried because it's not top of mind for a lot of people. And one of the things I've always shared is that this is really a lens through which we should be doing all of our legislating. The same way we think about when you legislate, think about going through a lens of equity so that we can right some of the wrongs with some of the racial injustices in our communities and in our country. To me, climate change is also that, right? And so I say that because oftentimes I'm talking about green infrastructure and mass transit, and I don't even say the word climate change. This is about economic development, but it's green economic development, right? And so I think not only is it building infrastructure like that, but when we also think about retaining talent in our area, that's something that we struggle with here in the 55th district, keeping young people, having millennials start their businesses here, settle with their families here and stay in our area, which we already decided has the best parks in the whole country, right? When we're thinking about all of those things, guess what? Every study, and I've worked with lots of millennials and Gen Zers. One of my organizations was all about Gen Z. They don't like cars, actually. A lot of folks want to be able to have bikeability in their communities. That's something that we need to focus on. A lot of times, folks want to have mass transit options in their cities and in their regions. Those are the kinds of things that we need to be investing in. And then to invest in the clean energy and all of those to make sure that we're still cutting down on emissions. And I know that there is will to do that. So I think that there's a lot of ways that we need to be thinking about all of these different options to reduce our dependency. But I will add also, at the end of the day, I've driven this district. It's about 60 miles long. There's a lot of miles on my car, so I'm glad it's fuel efficient. But we also have to create opportunities for people who are inevitably going to need cars or going to need to transport themselves, and support the people who make those cars here, some of them here in our own region, right here in Rochester area, to make sure that we can move towards cleaner fuel.
Okay. What additional funding programs would you like to see Nyserda offer to help convert existing buildings, as well as the state's vehicle fleet, to something that's more climate friendly, that cuts emissions rapidly?
Well, I think that, again, not to, a lot of these things can be addressed in similar ways. It's interesting when you think about complex problems, the answers aren't always complex. They might be challenging, but in many times they can be pretty simple. So just like we talked about how we wanted to kind of shift our dependency on passenger cars and transportation, right? I think it's similar when we think about this. So again, how do we make it a hospitable environment for people to make investments in converting these buildings, right? How do we incentivize that? And then when I think about the same thing around the vehicle fleets and getting lower emissions, it's the same thing that we wanted to do for our passenger cars, or for making sure that our buses, are lowering emissions. We can do all of that here as well. And I think the other thing that's been really interesting that I think we need to consider is that we're going to need to put people back to work. We've seen what COVID-19 has done to our economy. We've seen where we need to kind of boost our small and medium-sized businesses here locally, and also just get people back to work. We have record high unemployment right now. All of these climate change investments give us another opportunity to not only employ technologies that we know are working because they piloted in all sorts of places. We know they are working, but then to get people back to work and do the training that they need to be able to move into those kinds of positions. And I think that we need to do more thinking about it like that, because I think that we will get more broad support on a lot of these things, so that we're not talking about a theoretical future climate change. We're talking about right now. We're talking about jobs for people right now. We're talking about living wage jobs for people right now. And we're talking about doing actual productive building that's actually going to help us in the future, which I think at this point, we have no excuse not to do.
Great. The people least responsible for greenhouse gas emissions are disproportionately subject to the impacts, harmful impacts of climate change, such as longer, hotter heat waves. What should the state be doing to address this broad inequity?
How much time do you have? You only have 2 minutes, because timekeeper will stop me, because I could talk for a day on this. You know, I said it at the top. As I said, when we talk about any of these policies, I truly, and I mean this, and it's on every Zoom I've been on probably in the last 6 months, you can think about it through a lens of equity, and you can think about it through a lens of climate change. And I promise you, when you do that, you will move in the right direction. How do I know that? Because when we are thinking about some of the least resourced people, when we think about some of our lowest income communities, here we have to talk about it in the 55th district. We have a lot of concentrated poverty, not just in our city, but also in our rural areas, right? When you think about policies that protect and support those groups of people living at that intersection of life, you're talking about policies that will help us all. Because when they're thriving, when we can fix things for that group of people, they're going to be fixed for all of us. And so I think some of the really important work that we need to do is to always be thinking about who is being affected the most by these issues and how do we solve it for them. And as I said before, these are not siloed issues, right? Let's think about COVID-19. When you look at the comorbidities for people who are more affected, who are losing their life, who are on more ventilators, pollutants in the air, higher rates of asthma. These are the kinds of things that you get from living in some of the overpolluted areas, areas where perhaps your water isn't as safe, areas perhaps there are more pollutants in the air that you're exposed to, where there might be mold in your home that you're exposed to. So all of these things are so intersectional. We have to send leaders who understand even just what the word intersectionality is, that understand that these things are all playing into each other and that we can actually solve for them and stop some of these inequities from happening. If we can solve this issue, that means the next time a public health crisis comes, the next time a respiratory illness comes, we may not see the disparities that we saw this time. That means that we're setting ourselves up so that we stop talking about huge aspects, huge instances of asthma in some of our lower income communities. So I think that that is really important. And I know I'm out of time, but I have to add one thing because this is really, really an important piece. It's not just about sending someone to a majority. It's not just about sending a leader who understands these issues. It's someone who can identify, who has the lived experience, but also who can identify the people in the community that have to be at that table. So that's why I'm always saying working with our grassroots organizations, many of them who are co-sponsoring today, these are the people that are often closest to the problem. Even the local Sierra Club has decided, you know, we need to look at intersectionality. We need to look at racial equity as part of our issue here. These are the organizations I think that need to be with us at the table when we're making these decisions to ensure that we move forward in a way that we're bringing everyone with us and not leaving anyone behind. Thanks for letting me go through.
All right, and now it's summer. We have to kick it over to Julie. She has some audience questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeremy. The first question we have, we're going to try to ask these in the same order we asked earlier, is how do you feel about solar farms?
Well, solar farms are, I mean, I talked about this kind of at the top, right? If we think about our aggressive goals for a CLCPA, this is a part of the equation. we're going to have to move to more renewable energy. Having said that, I've also talked to a lot of our local communities, and I know that there's a lot of concern around how we move forward and the way in which we move forward, how fast we move forward. Both things have to be true, frankly. Both things have to be true. We have to take bold action, and we have to be able to work with local communities. I think that so far we've done a decent job of kind of streamlining this process to make sure that folks are still heard. But at the end of the day, we're going to have to make these creative solutions because this is a crisis that has already started. At this point, we are not stopping climate change. We're slowing it down. And more than that, when you think about our region here, a lot of times what people bring up is climate refugees, because we're actually in a region that could thrive. We could truly be the center of where people want to come because we're at the forefront of so many of these technologies. We have businesses that are knocking down the door right now, because I've talked to a few of them who want to come here, who want to bring jobs here, and who want to be a part of that story. And so I think we have an incredible opportunity in this area to bring jobs, to bring sustainable, renewable energy sources. But we also always have to have people at the table who are actually going to be affected most directly. And that goes to the thing I said about equity as well, is making sure that those people who are most affected are also a part of those conversations.
And following up on that, do you support wind power and wind turbines in the district?
I think once again, as we think about where we're moving in the future, renewable energy, wind, solar energy, that is all going to be a part of the equation. And I think that here in the Rochester region, we truly, and I know I sound like a broken record, but it's because I really do believe it. I think that we have such an opportunity to be a leader in that. But more than that, New York State has an opportunity to be a leader in that. You know, so many folks, I think, just think of New York as progressive and, you know, they're always at the forefront. But on some things, and I'm sure Julie would agree, because you've been fighting for these things, on some things, we haven't moved as quickly as we needed to. We haven't been as bold as we need to. We haven't been the leader for every other state to look at, to say, oh, that's how we should do that. Let's follow New York's, let's follow New York and, you know, the way they're doing those things. And so again, I think that if we want to be leaders as a state, well, I want us to be leading it in the 55th district. And I think that we have to continue to look at ways that we can create more energy and really move ourselves in the direction of more renewable energy, attracting people to our region, building those jobs, creating the partnerships, using the proven technologies that we know will work and that are sustainable. That's what we need to do. And in order to do that, we're going to need someone in Albany who not only understands that, but who's at the table where all of those decisions are being made to make sure that we actually get some support in that.
Shifting gears a little bit, what will you do? I know you mentioned before that you personally need to work on this issue, but what will you do to drive composting and food scrap collection in the district?
Well, first of all, we have to give props here because the legislation that's happened on a state level is astounding and tremendous to be able to have some of these larger food generators actually a part of this solution, which is amazing. And it's definitely the systemic answer that we need through legislation. But of course, as we all know, you need to legislate differently. And as I've seen this working with cities with recycling, you legislate differently when it comes to major companies and corporations. They need to make certain changes, right? We need to make them accountable. They need to, you know, close the loop themselves. But also on an individual level, I think that there's so much that we can do. And so one of the things that I am actually very proud of the city of Rochester to have done here is around this food scraps and collecting food scraps and starting this pilot around really figuring out how do we build the infrastructure here locally to be able to create this municipal composting program, right? How do we make it easier for individuals to be able to do that? And guess what? That would not have happened without funding from the state, without our IT program. That would not have happened. And so that's when I say partnerships that work, when I say resources coming into our community, when I say use the proven technologies and changes that we have seen are successful. This is exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about communities who have the foresight, again, and the courage and innovation to want to enter in these spaces. That can be scary, right? I remember, I mean, I struggle to do this personally. Most of the companies I've worked with, we all do composting there right at the office. And I know it's, you know, you got to figure it out. You got to get the right worms. You got to make sure it's aerated. You know, it can be scary if it's a new thing, but this is where our governments come into play. Our governments are able to actually make it easier for individuals to do it. You know, the work I did with recycling, we incentivized the behavior. That's why I talk about incentives a lot. We incentivized the behavior of recycling versus throwing trash and diverting it out of the waste stream. We can do the same thing when it comes to food scraps and when it comes to doing that on an individual level. And we can make it easier for people. As simple as it was taking a huge garbage can and a tiny recycling can and just swapping it and giving people a huge recycling bin and a tiny garbage, guess what? It went down. The garbage went down. Diversion went up into recycling. Those are the kinds of things we can do. So hopefully when we get our food scrap program, it's going to be a huge bin because we know that that's one of the biggest contributors to our waste stream. But, you know, I have to give kudos to the city for being able to have that foresight and moving with a program like that.
One of the largest sources of carbon-free energy in the region is the Gina nuclear power plant. It is also one of the oldest in the nations. How can we continue the supply of clean energy in the area?
Well, I think it's the same as every other clean energy option that we have, right? I mean, none of these are silver bullets. Not one thing is going to keep us moving towards cleaner and cleaner energy. And in fact, they all have to be a part of the solution. And I have to go back to, you know, this idea of phases, right? You work with what you have to be able to divert, I'm still in the waste stream mindset, and able to move towards cleaner energy, right? And you do the best you can. When you come up with a new technology, which Rochester region will be, the 55th district will be the leader in, because we are going to be this clean technology hub. When you find new technologies, you need to figure out how do you fill the gaps where your last technology fell out, stopped working, and then how do you build better for the future? And I think that these are the conversations we need to be having around what works for each community. And I think that right now, Western New York is often missing their voice in this discussion. And we know that we care about the environment. As you've said many times, we have some of the most beautiful lakes up here. We've got a Gray Lake, we've got our Finger Lakes, and people love coming to it. People love living here. I love Canandaigua Lake. That's my happy place in the summer. And so we have to make sure that we're also getting a voice and representation in these conversations, because it's going to happen regardless. But my job is to make sure that is the 55th district in that conversation? Are our needs being made a part of the consideration? And how do we move forward so that we are also investing heavily in clean energy, but also doing right by folks today?
Great. How would you fund the transition away from fossil fuels? What's the right balance between using market forces, making polluters pay, and direct government spending?
I like this question because I think it touches on a lot of the different things that we've talked about. So first of all, I just want to be clear that I do believe, if you probably haven't gotten this yet, I do believe that government has a role to play. I don't just believe that because I'm running to be in said government to play that role, but also because I've seen where there is a lack of intervention, whether it's local governments or state governments, and where markets are led free, right? And so, you know, I go back to my example with working in recycling and the fact that it's really tough, just individually. I mean, think of all the things we hold in our heads every day, to be taking all of these actions individually. And so we have to have our governments that are actually going to put resources to educating us, to making sure we understand our options, to making sure we understand the consequences of what we're doing. And I think that that's huge. I'll tell you, when I got to tell people that your taxes went down when you diverted more waste out of the landfill, it became a very easy conversation for some folks, but we have to be having that conversation. That means investing in people, even if it is going door to door, right? To share this information, to make sure that people truly understand. And I know a lot of our grassroots organizations are doing this, but how can our government make sure that there are more people doing it, that we're amplifying those efforts to make sure that we're educating people? And so I think that the infrastructure is huge, and the government has a role in doing that. And I also think we need to really step back and understand government has always played a role in any industry. It played a role in making sure that plastic industry got as big as it did. It's always played this role. And so we need to now play that role, but in a way that's going to set our entire planet up for a future and really shift the investments and the incentives that in the, I always say this hospitable environment that we've created to now do that for companies who can move us away from fossil fuels, for producers who can move us away from fossil fuels. So I have to remind us all, this is not new. This is not new. Our government has always interacted in these industries. And now we are saying that it is incumbent on our government to move us away from these industries with things like clean energy, with things like renewable energy. The act itself is not new. It's simply where we're putting our focus.
Do you support fully funding the Environmental Protection Fund?
Yes. I'll give you an extra 1 minute and 59 seconds.
Well, that's okay. We'll take it. This is one, it's a little repetitive based on some of the answers you've already given, but I'm going to ask it because I asked the same question of Mr. Misick. What are the most important things that you as a New York State Senator can do to impact climate change? What bills would you support, or tell us about at least one bill that you would introduce?
Well, yes, a summation of everything that I've said in the last 20 or so minutes is everything that I want to do as a state senator to be able to move forward on all these climate change goals. The first thing that I think we need to do is be a member of our Democratic majority and strengthen the majority of climate change believing, science-backed, honestly, people who are courageous enough to stand up and say, this might not feel like a crisis for everyone right now, but it is a crisis for someone. And it's going to be a crisis for all of us. And I think that that is a huge role that our state senators need to play. We've talked about a lot of different pieces of legislation that I would wholeheartedly support. One that just comes up in my mind because of a local program that we have here around pollinators. There's I think it's the Protect Birds and Bees Act that Senator Hoyland has introduced. Let's get that passed. We saw that locally we had such great success here with the Seneca Park Zoo, working with the Department of Transportation, creating an entire, and of course these words are probably wrong, but an entire pollinator habitat. So we know that there are successful, again, that's not even a fancy technology, but that's just a partnership that worked. You had two groups that had complementary interests and skill sets, and you were able to put that together to actually drive change. And that is literally changing things here on the local level. So I do think that there's a way to actually bring legislation with that as well, with the Birds and Bees Protection Act. But the truth is there are tons of pieces of legislation to make sure that we can actually meet our goals of the CLCPA right now in the Senate, waiting to get signed into law. And my job is going to be twofold. One is to be an added voice in a majority who understands the importance of climate change and the importance of bold action to combat it. But two is to finally give our region a voice back at that table where everything is happening, where every negotiation, where every law is being written and debated. We don't have representation, and we have to, because if I'm not sitting at that table, we're not considered in that consideration.
So one of the things we worked on this year was passage of the first Environmental Bond Act in over 25 years. And part of the focus of that Bond Act would have been helping to support communities to protect them against flooding. You touched on this before. Obviously, you've had flooding in Irondequoit, on Lake Ontario, and other parts of the district. Would you support a bond act, again, advancing that obviously it didn't move forward this year in light of the state's current financial situation? And B, what do you think we need to be doing to help protect communities from flooding, which is going to become an issue more and more as we deal with climate change, since in the Northeast, unlike in California, they're going to see more fires and droughts. In the Northeast, even though it's dry right now, we're generally speaking going to see more water.
Yeah. And it just, I guess it was a luck that would have it that literally, I think it was about a week ago, that I was walking up and down the Lake Ontario shore and literally watching where the water had come up to and where it was going, and learning about how we're trying to revitalize, our marinas and protect some of these homes for people who are coming in, and then building, to be more resilient in the future. First of all, I do advocate and support, I should just get that out of the way, advocate and support for fulfilling that bond act. And I think I was disappointed, along with many people, that it won't be out there this year. But we can't just put on hold all of our investments in the climate. I understand that everyone is hurting right now. I get it. I've talked to hundreds of small business owners here in our area, in our district. I've talked to nurses and teachers and professors, and I've talked to so many people, and no one is really doing well, except for the CEO of Zoom right now. And people aren't thinking about a lot of these issues, but we have to stay focused, because like I said before, I really do think that we can include some of our climate change investments into some of the other things that we have to take care of here, right? When we think about flooding, and we think about what that's doing to our communities, and how we need to protect our waterways, all of that will also affect commerce if our businesses can't open, right? That affects home ownership, people buying homes, if everyone's scared to buy a home in these areas. That can affect tourism. Boy, do I know, tourism is huge for the Finger Lakes. People flock there for the especially right now, honestly, a lot of people are coming upstate. All of these things are part of, our acute crisis right now of economic development. And so I really am, and maybe this is my plea to my future colleagues as well, that we have to consider these things as part of the entire puzzle, and not in a silo of dealing with water, because our time is running out. Up here in Lake Ontario, we were lucky to get some state funding, but as I've already been warned, they will be knocking on my door to get the rest of the funding that they need. And I just think that we can't leave it behind. I mean, it's certainly not something that we can just kind of put on hold, because it is something that will barrel towards you, and has been, no matter what.
Invasive species are an issue in the district, and swallowing up our native plants. Is this an issue you're aware of? Do you think it's important to fight, and how will you do so?
I think all of these issues are important to fight, right? I just happened to be coincidentally thinking about this issue the other day, because, not to get gruesome, but we're all environmentalists here. We were over at the lake, and I was again learning about some of the flooding that had occurred, and I thought what I was looking at were like little volleyballs or something, popping up in the, I don't know why volleyballs, little balls popping up in the lake, but really what it was fish who had died. And part of it was because of this invasive species. We've seen, things like algae blooms happening in Canandaigua Lake. Of course, all of these things need to be dealt with. And I think that one of the things that we can do is, not to, again, harp on this, but one of the things we need to do is, if we are making any sort of investments, if we are, supporting, any of our watershed councils here locally, in Canandaigua, they've done incredible work, but they have to know we have their back. They have to know that we are going to fight for the funding that they need, because this work doesn't just happen out of nowhere. And so I think that the best thing I can do, and this is what I will be doing, is taking all of this to make sure that it's actually a part of the conversation, because unfortunately, I don't know how much of this is a part of the conversation today as we speak.
Okay, and the last question we have from audience folks is, we know that water and wastewater infrastructure are very expensive, that the local governments are responsible for managing them. We know that there's billions of dollars in need, roughly $32 billion and $38 billion between drinking water infrastructure and wastewater infrastructure. And what do you think we need to do to help support local governments addressing these needs to ensure that we have good water quality?
Well, speaking with our county executive recently, and again, most of the conversation is here's what we're going to need money for. But you know, let's also just go back again, because I really think it's important to keep perspective of what we're talking about, right? Yes, our counties are responsible for a lot of that funding, but also we are cutting right now on the state level so much of the funding that goes to our localities and counties because we haven't gotten it from the federal level, that the onus is feeling even greater. And so even if, you know, counties are responsible for making these investments and for dealing with our water systems, the state government has a responsibility to alleviate some of that onus on our localities. And sometimes that's in the form of education and healthcare, and making sure that we're not siphoning away dollars, because at the end of the day, this is all one budget. These are all our tax dollars and different, you know, grants that are coming in, but it's all one budget. And so right now, I think we are putting an undue onus on our localities to deal with the number of things that they're dealing with. And let's not forget, it's our counties, at least here in Western New York, it's our county that has helped us move through COVID-19 without greater death, without such a significant impact here in Western New York. And I'm grateful for that. And it shows that our counties are able to act cost effectively and efficiently, and that they can get the work done. But it also means that there is an incredible onus on them right now. And I think that our state needs to be bolder in creating and passing revenue generating ideas to make sure that we can give the funding that our counties need, not just for this, but again, for healthcare, for education, for so many of the things that they have lost out on and are feeling this undue pressure this year. And that's what I want to do. You know, I want to make sure that people feel like they have a partner in government. I want people to make sure that when I come back and forth from Albany to Monroe and Ontario counties, I'm here to do the work. Right? I'm here to listen to what's happening on the ground, because I think that that's the only way that we're going to be effective in our legislating in Albany.
Okay, Jeremy, if you want to.
Yep, Samra, if you'd like to offer your closing statement.
Sure. Thank you. Well, I just have to say thank you again. This was a really wonderful forum, and thank you all for, of course, you understand the importance of doing something like this, and looking forward to more conversation in the future. But to all of you listeners out there, do have a message for you. You know, this year we have an opportunity to send dedicated leaders into our Democratic Senate majority who believe in science, who believe that more action is needed to slow climate change, and who will actually be able to get the work done. And that's important. Right now, the Rochester region isn't at the table. In fact, we're not even in the room. And this year we can change that by sending a Democratic senator to Albany. You know, as I stated throughout this time, my commitment to this work has been consistent. Whether it was developing water projects in Guatemala as a Peace Corps volunteer, working with towns and villages in New York to improve waste management, or helping cities rebuild after natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina. I'd be honored to work alongside powerful advocates like the League of Conservation Voters, like the Rochester People's Climate Coalition, the Citizens Climate Lobby, and so many others that are doing important work here. This community has been my home for most of my life. My family has lived in Ontario County in our beautiful Finger Lakes region for the past 100 years. I know what's at stake if we don't get the resources that we need, and if we don't insist that our post-COVID economic recovery is a green economic recovery. Let's make sure that we're keeping climate action in the conversation while we fight for quality healthcare, while we fight for quality education, and getting people back to work in their living wage jobs. This year, up and down the ballot, we have an opportunity to vote as if the future of humanity depends on it, because it does. We must take a systemic, community-based approach to environmental policy, and that's exactly what I plan on doing. So I wanted to thank all of you for hosting me today, and thank everyone else. If you would like to learn more about our campaign, you can go to samraforsenate.com.
Great. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time tonight. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. We hope you learned a few new things about the environment and about our candidates. Thank you also to Jeremy for moderating our panel this evening. If you tuned in late or you want to rewatch, this video will be on our Facebook page at facebook.com/NYLCV and on our YouTube page at youtube.com/NYLCV. Most importantly, be sure to vote. Please take our pledge to vote early. Early voting starts on October 24th, and Election Day again is on November 3rd. Follow us at NYLCV on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram for updates. And if you're not already on our mailing list, please sign up at www.nylcv.org. Thank you again tonight. Have a stay safe and stay healthy out there. And I'm sure there's other debates to watch tonight. Thank you.